So in this lesson, we're going to move beyond the commonsensical perspective and start to clarify some concepts around leadership. Now, just looking at a basic historical trend, management and leadership could be seen as much the same thing. What happened throughout academic research is the terminology has changed. So what used to be called administration seemed a bit boring. Nobody wanted to be an administrator. So instead, they became managers. The same thing happened. So then they became executives. And yet again, the same thing happens. So now they've become leaders. Now, leadership is obviously a very exciting term, and it can seduce you into wanting to be one. But ultimately, it's really the same set of ideas extending through history, just with different names. But in the common sense perspective, we are seeing a difference between a manager and a leader, and it's something that's worth talking about. What we see with a manager is someone who just has this sort of formal position of management and is just managing you because they're in a position of authority. Whereas a leader is somebody that you want to follow. There are ideas of influence and emotions that come in, strong and complex interpersonal reasons to be following this person. So at a common sense level, even though the historical trend suggests that management and leadership are much the same thing, at this commonsensical level, that's how we divide them. And to make sense of this divide in a meaningful way, what we might be able to say is that management, because it's just this position of authority and it's very, very formal, management can be seen as quite neat. But leadership, with its influence and its followership and its relationships and with its emotions, that could be seen as quite messy. And let's try and make a little bit more sense of leadership through this messy lens by turning to the work of Henry Mintzberg. Now, while Mintzberg is not necessarily the most mainstream of management thinkers, he's perhaps one of the most useful in understanding how we're beginning to look at leadership today. In the 1970s, he researched what managers actually did in practice. And what he found was, rather than being these heroic people who sat in rooms and thought deep thoughts about the organisation and strategised, and it was this very controlled, formal way of looking at an organisation and running an organisation. What he found was it was an extremely messy and fragmented process. Rather than having this contemplative long-term analysis of the organisation sitting in their offices and having reflective time, that they were slaves to the moment. They had task after task after task, which they had to perform at a relentless pace. They were constantly distracted. Distraction after distraction after distraction. And he discovered that the average length of time they spent on any specific task was 9 minutes. He discovered the dimensions of leadership in practice. And the first dimension was the huge, enormous quantity of work that was coming at them at a relentless pace. The second was that fragmentation, variety and brevity were the dominant forms of the leadership experience. Instead of having a long time to sit and look at one element of leadership, it was coming at them like this, bang, 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 different, different, different. And rather than have this analytical, philosophical idea of long-term strategic direction, leaders preferred things that were current, specific and non-routine. So they were really focusing on what was going on in the moment rather than developing these long-term strategic visions. Furthermore, a leader preferred verbal rather than written communication. A leader wanted to speak to its people rather than write to his people. And actually in this web of this verbal communication, there was this web of internal and external contacts that the leader constantly had to navigate through. So there were ongoing conversations with people internal to the organisation and external to the organisation. And the leader was having to adapt his language and his role constantly as he moved in and out of the organisation. And one of the surprising things was that the leader didn't actually feel like they had a direct amount of control over the organisation. They were actually a slave to what was going on in the organisation and adapting to those pressures at all time. So while we saw and perceived the idea of this heroic leader taking the organisation with him, Mintzberg found that he was constantly responding to the organisation. And something important to note is that this research took place in 1973. That was before smartphones. That was before laptops. That was before emails. That was before text messages. That was before open plan offices where everybody's moving around the same space. work has become relentlessly quicker. It's become more and more fragmented. So it might be that having 9 minutes to spend on a specific task is more time than a contemporary leader ever has. So in the midst of all of this frantic activity, Mintzberg discovered that these senior leaders played 3 different sets of roles: interpersonal, informational, and decisional. And they were constantly adapting their performance between these roles depending on the audience and the situation they were facing. Let's look at each one in turn. There are 3 different interpersonal roles. There's the leadership role, the figurehead role, and the liaison role. Now, the leadership role is when the leader is just trying to achieve organisational objectives through standard functional means. How do we get the organisation from here to there? How do we ramp up productivity? How do we deliver our products? How do we do it effectively and efficiently? The figurehead role is far more symbolic. It's when the leader is standing out in front of the organisation, either presenting internally to the organisation in a ritual or ceremony, or externally, where the leader is representing the organisation, perhaps in front of the media. And the liaison role is when the leader is talking to different organisations and different people to try and get them to do work with the company. Then there are the 3 informational roles: the monitor, the disseminator, and the spokesperson. Now, the monitor role is when the leader is trying to gather important information for his unit. The disseminator is when he gets that information and he disseminates it into the unit. The spokesperson is when he's taking this information and taking it outside the unit and perhaps even outside the organisation. He's still disseminating it, but not just internally with the people he directly works with. It's beyond that set of people. Then there are the 4 decisional roles: the entrepreneurial role, the disturbance handler role, the resource allocator role, and the negotiator role. The entrepreneur role is when the leader takes responsibility for delivering new and improved products. The disturbance handler role is when the leader is taking action during a crisis. The resource allocator role is in charge of resources. It will negotiate and schedule budgets and activities, etc., etc. This is what the leader does in that role. The negotiator role, there's no real set transactions or boundaries. Negotiator is when you're trying to work out what future directions might look like. When Mintzberg did this research in the 1970s, all the leaders that he researched were male. So when I'm talking about this, I will constantly use the male pronoun he. So it's important to note that Mintzberg was before his time in this case. So these ideas we've talked about were actually pre-existing this call for evidence-based leadership. What Mintzberg found was, in the midst of all these theoretical musings about what leaders actually did, when you looked at the practice, when you looked at the evidence, it was very, very different. It wasn't reflective, it was frenetic. And it's important to continually have Mintzberg's ideas in the back of your mind as you navigate through these lessons and the entire course. The promise of evidence-based leadership is it will help organisations and leaders make better and better decisions, because the decisions they will make will be based on evidence rather than the idea that, oh, this person said so, this leadership guru said so. This promises a better organisational life, where all of the things that happen in an organisation can be fed into systems of reflection and critical thought, turned into a feedback loop and sent back into the organisation so they can be used to improve organisational performance, organisational experience, organisational behaviours, and ultimately how a leader leads. There are a number of challenges though. First of all, lots of managers lead sort of intuitively, the way that they believe they should lead. And evidence can actually stop them from doing that, and they can resist quite strongly. Not enough organisations actually do any management research. So it's very difficult for them to start understanding what's going on internally. And they also feel that universities and researchers can't really help them with their problems, that their problems are unique and they can't be generalised or categorised in a meaningful way. So in conclusion, in this lesson, we've tried to sort of frame what will be going on throughout the leader's individual lessons, plus the rest of the course, where rather than assume that everything is hard fact, there's this messiness and adaptability and evidence and bias going on at all stages. Now, whereas I will try and point out and help people navigate through that, I have personal biases as well. And there are times where you might listen to me and say, I don't believe that. that's fine. It's up to you to read through the evidence critically and decide what is useful for you, what is useful for your leadership style, and which styles you wish to develop.